Today we read from Psalm 146, verses 5 through 8.
Happy are those whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord their God.
Who made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them.
Who keeps faith forever.
Who executes justice for the oppressed.
Who gives food to the hungry.
The Lord sets the prisoners free.
The Lord opens the eyes of the blind.
The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous.
We also read two parables from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, beginning with the first verse.
Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for the people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming in to him and saying, grant me justice against my opponent. For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?
He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted.
Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God.
There's a point in Just Mercy where Bryan Stevenson, the lawyer whose memoir of the same name provides the story of the movie, explains part of what motivates him. I came out of law school with grand ideas in my mind about how to change the world, but Mr. Macmillan made me realize that we can't change the world with only ideas in our minds. We need conviction in our hearts. This man taught me how to stay hopeful, because I now know that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Hope allows us to push forward even when the truth is distorted by the people in power. It allows us to stand when they tell us to sit down and to speak when they say be quiet. Mr. Macmillan is the other central character in our story. Walter Macmillan, or Johnny D as his family and friends call him, is arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for the 1987 murder of an 18-year-old woman in Alabama. Stevenson brought fresh hope to Macmillan's case when he began representing Macmillan during his appeal and clemency hearings. This hope propped up both the lawyer and the wrongfully convicted client at different times during the incredible journey chronicled in the movie. Some who are tuning into this message today have already watched the movie or read the book upon which it's based. For those who haven't yet had the chance, I hope you'll be inspired to do so. Here's the thing about this story. It's all too familiar. While there are deeply engaging moments in this narrative, I found it hard to be all that surprised. by the details of Johnny D's wrongful arrest and race-based conviction. My guess is that you too will find an all too familiar refrain in how yet another man is victimized by a criminal justice system deeply tainted by systemic racism, historic poverty, and white privilege. I'm left to wonder how many stories like this have been told over the years, how many books have been written and read, how many movies have been made and watched. But where is the action? Where is the response? Is change ever going to come? Learning of the story of the falsely convicted Reuben Hurricane Carter, Bob Dylan sang in 1976, "Couldn't help but make me feel ashamed to live in a land where justice is a game." Changing how this game is played is exactly what Stevenson set out to do after he graduated from Harvard Law School in the mid-'80s. Conscious that his own story was not all that different from the stories of the men he encountered on death row, sparked a response from Stevenson that was rooted in his upbringing and his faith in God. Stevenson, speaking to an audience of students at Seattle Pacific University in 2017, said, "For young people of faith, believing things that we haven't seen, well, that defines who we are. Believing that we can create a community that is better at justice, better at equal treatment, better at overcoming racism and bigotry against the poor is essential, and then struggling to achieve those things, that's the work." It sounds hard, but it's actually glorious. It's wondrous. It's energizing. It will make you feel privileged to have a purpose, and that purpose can be integrating what you believe in your heart with what you see and understand with your mind. That's an exciting way to live. This is my prayer for the church, that we see the pursuit of justice as a holy calling, and as Stevenson puts it, an exciting way to live. As people of faith, we are responsible for the communities in which we have been placed by God. God expects us to care for these communities and to work relentlessly on behalf of our neighbors. The unfortunate and tragic death of George Floyd has brought this expectation into even sharper focus for us who live here in the metro. But Floyd's death comes on the heels of Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Philando Castile and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many others. An important part of my prayer is that we might be roused from our complacency and make meaningful progress toward change. The stories told by the writers of the gospel were in part to accomplish something similar, to highlight injustice and inspire a faithful response. This is why we just heard these two parables from the Gospel of Luke. In the first, Jesus is describing the community of faith as a place where the search for justice needs to be as relentless as the widow who won't stop bringing her protests to the powerful. Then, in the second, Jesus draws an important distinction while describing how the faithful will seek out God's mercy. The religiously expert Pharisee lacks something the tax collector possesses: the knowledge that we all fall short. In God's eyes, we are the same. We are equally undeserving and yet equally loved. This is the scale of justice that God has created for the world. As a result, any time we attempt to define or order this world by its perceived differences, like the Pharisee, putting our thumb on the scale, we will only find ourselves humbled by the outcome. So we are called to ask ourselves, will God find favor in how we have responded to the pleas for justice and mercy coming from our neighbors? I suspect this is a question that motivated Stevenson in his work with the incarcerated and the Equal Justice Institute. And his work can be lifted up as a faithful response to the deep injustices embedded in our country's criminal justice system. As he reflected on the film and how it might be received by people of faith, Stevenson said, "I hope it causes us to talk more about this need for redemption and grace to everyone. We can't be believers and be so hopeless about people who fall down. Life without parole is a hopeless sentence, and we impose that sentence on people who are drug addicted and drug dependent, people who have made poor choices around money. There has to be more hopefulness in the way we think about any person's ability to recover, to be redeemed. Then the second thing is that we need to see people of faith in spaces where there's a lot of despair and anguish, where there's a lot of trauma and abuse. I can't think of any place where that is more evident than in our jails and prisons. Just Mercy does a masterful job of highlighting the challenges facing this country, and the performances by Michael B. Jordan as Stevenson and Jamie Foxx as Johnny D make their struggles personal and painfully authentic. Both are flawed heroes. Stevenson has to own up to his idealistic naivete, and Johnny D's history is not without problem. But this is a good reminder that God's mercy isn't dependent on our past. At the same time, it can powerfully define our future. Of course, there is triumph experienced in the ultimate reversal of Johnny D's conviction and his subsequent freedom. Mercy comes, but I think the audience is left wondering whether it lives up to the film's title. Are those responsible for inflicting years of pain and suffering onto McMillan and his family and his community held accountable? Of course not. And so the familiar story returns. Near the end of the movie, there's a scene where Stevenson and the freed McMillan are invited to testify before a U.S. Senate hearing on the death penalty, where Stevenson describes what has been gained. Through this work, I've learned that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. That the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. That the character of our nation isn't reflected in how we treat the rich and the privileged, but how we treat the poor, the disfavored, and condemned. This should sound like familiar words for people of faith like us. Jesus was clear on what being in relationship with God calls for, and we need to keep these commands always before us. Yet it's amazing how often we continue to fall short. Again, speaking to the students of Seattle Pacific University, Stevenson says, "We've gotten very hierarchical about mercy. We've gotten very conditional about mercy. We don't want to give people mercy unless they meet our conditions. That's not really mercy. Mercy is what you give to people who don't deserve it. Mercy is what you give to people who can't make the showing that you want them to make. You make that showing of mercy not just for them, but also for you. What I think mercy requires is that we understand human need and respond to it." So what are the needs around us this day? We know that our neighbors are hungry. We know that our neighbors are sick. We know that our neighbors are being victimized by historically unjust practices being propped up by a system too afraid to let go of the privileges it has possessed. Knowing and acknowledging these things is an important first step in making the changes God and our neighbors are asking of us. Stevenson says, It's easy to expect the worst part of you and just stay in that place, because it takes work and faith and hope and belief and love to transcend some of the difficult and painful things that we do to one another. I think that's what we're called to do, and in that respect, the work can be both ministry and advocacy at the same time. Finally, I want to lift up the hope that this movie suggests is available for those willing to take on this work. I know that this hope holds the key to our response as a community of faith and as a people loved by God. Let's give Bryan Stevenson the last word today. This past January, before the events of this tumultuous time took shape, Stevenson offered this to those preparing to watch and hopefully be moved by his story captured in this film. I do think there is something better waiting for us in this country. I do think there's something that feels more like freedom than inequality of justice. But to get there, we're going to have to talk more honestly. We're going to have to work harder. We're going to have to do the difficult things that are sometimes required, to love mercy and to do justice and to walk humbly with God. Thanks be to God. Amen.